Welcome to PACKOLUTION. In this podcast series, you'll hear the experts of the packaging industry talking about sustainability and the future of packaging. It is brought to you by Watron and hosted by one of its founders, Michaela Wachtel, and Sales Director Ton Kniepscher.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of PACKOLUTION, the disruptive podcast brought to you by Watron. Today we have Ron van Hilst, the Global Packaging Technology Lead of Cargill, as our guest, with whom we will be talking about one of the largest unknown food manufacturers in the world. Welcome, Ron.
Hello, Tom.
Ron, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your career path?
Yeah, sure. I'm now working about 36 years in packaging. I started at Unilever in a packaging development team. From that, I moved as a packaging development manager at Calvé in Delft, where we produced peanut butter sauces. Based on that, I moved to another more detergent and dishwash type of products, also Unilever, to develop pack formats as well. Then after reorganization, I moved to Friesland Campina, where I become one of the packaging managers for long-lasting products and especially focused on Greece and Asia. From there, I moved to Kraft Heinz in Nijmegen, also on a European packaging innovation department, where I was leading a packaging development team of about 24 people scattered over Europe, developing packaging and pack formats for the non-Heinz ketchup brands, the so-called local jewel market. And after that, I started about 5 years ago as the Global Packaging Technology Lead at Cargill, where I am responsible for predominantly the Latin America market.
It's an impressive journey.
It's a long journey.
True.
As mentioned in the introduction, Cargill is one of the largest food manufacturers, and yet hardly anybody knows the name. Could you please tell the audience in which areas Cargill does operate?
Yeah, sure. Well, it is interesting. I also have to admit, when I applied for this role at Cargill, I had to dive into the internet to find out a little bit more about this company because I wasn't aware of what they did. But during my job interview, they told me that if you are in front of a shelf in a supermarket, about 70 to 75% of the raw materials come from Cargill. It is a global company employing about 150,000 people worldwide. And we started 150 years ago as a trader in agriculture products. And from there, we grow out we produce now meat and poultry, starch and sweeteners, animal and nutrition, edible oil. So quite a lot of different type of products focused in fact on three legs, which is food service, business to business, which is the biggest part of our portfolio. That's also why it's not really common known with a lot of people, because a small part is only fast moving consumer goods, and that is focused in India, a little bit in the US, and predominantly in Latin America. But for raw materials, for instance, we supply all big companies like Unilever, Danone, Nestle. They all buy raw material from us. One of our biggest customers, for instance, is McDonald's for our chicken nuggets, for instance.
And it's a privately owned company, right?
It is one private-owned company, and that's why it is the biggest private-owned company in the world. It's really impressive.
Last numbers I saw somewhere on the internet were $130 billion revenue.
Yeah, I don't know the latest figures, but that was, I think, last year.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge.
Let's jump right into the topic of packaging. Cargill operates in more than 70 countries. How does your sustainability strategy work? What is possible and what are the hurdles in relation to the different countries?
Well, what we have done is we defined a sustainability strategy not that long ago. We started with that reasonably late. So I think 1.5 years ago, we could agree on the sustainability strategy. And what we try to do is we try to fit in the different regions, but also in the different product types. And the basic of the sustainability strategy is not greenwashing, but really to have a positive impact on sustainability. What means that sometimes we go for a qualified resource for paper and board, for instance. On the other hand, we go on reducing waste of food. And in another example, we go for lightweighting the bottles, optimizing the transport situations so that we put less material on the market. And last but not least, in Europe, for instance, recyclability is quite substantial. In Brazil, for instance, it's almost none. So also there you have to adjust accordingly. Although it's changing in Brazil as well, that there are more and more initiatives to reuse material and collect it. But it's compared to Europe. Glass, for instance, I thought it was in Europe about 95% is collected. In Brazil, that is less than 10%.
I don't think it's a matter of will they change, but when they will change.
When? Yeah, I fully agree.
There was something that was really interesting that you mentioned in our preparation for the episode. You said kind of that there's more to packaging than just the wraparound product. What exactly do you mean by this?
Yeah, what I mean is that if you develop or design a packaging, you have to look at the whole supply chain. So what I mean with that is, let me give you an example. We try to reduce the weight of a plastic bottle for edible oil. When we use the technique currently used, we could only reduce about 1 gram on a 70.7 gram bottle, right? That was quite a challenge. So when we change the design and therefore create a stronger construction of the bottle itself, we could reduce more than 2 gram on that one. However, that is one thing. The other thing, what we wanted to do is we want to move from a corrugated box to a shrink film secondary pack format, because then we could load the trucks more efficient, so more bottles per truck, which was already a positive impact on the environment as well. But it can also have an impact during transport. So we did a lot of testing and trialing on what could be done, and if that new design was suitable for that application. So for one design idea, we had to develop 3 different legs in the supply chain.
So what is also relevant for packaging is the transport and logistic aspects, if I understand you correctly.
Yes, correct. What has been done predominantly, and that's not only Cargill, but you see that in more companies, is that they pack for the weakest link. So what they do is they go to the most critical circumstances which can happen in supply chain, and they overpack for that, right? Make it suitable for that. But if you look at the average transport conditions, then it is a substantial overpacking situation. What we did with Cargill is that we tried to find the most critical ones, and then we made a decision on how much the protection would be. And with that, we accept that in some extreme circumstances, we will have product damage. And that's a completely other way of looking at your application in supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
In the packaging industry, especially in the food industry, the so-called life cycle analysis, LCAs, are getting more popular and are being used more and more. What is your experience in that? Do you think this is the right approach, and does Cargill use this as well?
I think, yes, Cargill is using that. Yes, I think there is a benefit on using these type of tools. However, you have to be careful with that. What I mean with that is, at Cargill, we use it as a comparison for our current situation. Yeah. So all our packaging development project should have shown a better life cycle analysis. But again, as a comparison, what is the risk is these are tools, depending on where you put your focus, you can kind of influence the outcome. What I mean with that is if you look at a study of a life cycle analysis in the metal industry compared to glass, I know for sure that metal comes out better, right? The same you see the other way around. So to compare it with other pack formats, industry, supply chains, you have to be careful, but within your own supply chain, because you know that for 100%, it's a perfectly tool to compare and optimize.
Are you seeing this being used more and more also in your organization?
Yeah. We started with the first project, I think 2.5, 3 years ago with that. And because of the outcome, it is now a standard tool to be used in any new packaging development or packaging innovation type of project.
When we talk about packaging, we also talk about shelf life. There, a big issue is the best before date. There are currently many discussions about whether the best before date makes sense or not and how it should be designed. What is your opinion on that?
I do agree with some of the views that best before dates will influence and will have a negative impact on food waste. I mean, when I talk to my mom, she never looks at the best before date. She smells, she tastes, and she knows when the product can be eaten or drinking for sure. That is how she has been brought up. For me, I'm always look at that. I don't take any risk, so I throw it away. So adding a best before is influencing that. On the other hand, it is also important when you develop your product format. What I mean with that is, for instance, we have a tomato paste type of product where we had a 24 months shelf life. That requirement comes from an old situation where we come from metal cans now in plastic containers. Because of that requirement, you have to choose high barrier packaging material, which is expensive, which is not or difficult to recycle. And on top of that, it will increase the cost significantly. So what we are doing now at Cargill is we are looking at the cycle time of the product, and that will be determined for us what shelf life we need. So again, we will not overpack anymore.
I think that it's also important to differentiate between a best before and a use by date. I've always learned that use by is you should not eat it after this date, because like fish or chicken, but best before means exactly what it says. It's still good after that date.
Yeah, I fully agree on that, Tom. And especially for meat, for instance, it is important to know when it's not safe to eat it anymore or to consume it anymore.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. I didn't even think about that. In Germany, it's called differently. The date doesn't say, okay, you cannot eat it afterwards, but it only says, okay, you can eat it at least until then. But most people think, okay, one day after, okay, let's throw it away.
You will not die of it.
Yeah.
The best before date is not more and not less a date where the supplier can guarantee the quality.
Yeah.
After that, the quality will reduce. But again, it doesn't mean it's not good or dangerous to consume, right?
It's still edible.
It's still edible. And that is also funny because you see now shops, I've seen one in Amsterdam, but maybe they are across the Netherlands, who collect these products at the end of their expiring date or even over that, and they sell it for a reduced price because it's still good.
Yeah. True. Yeah.
And for food waste, that's a good initiative.
Tapping back on what you said before about the tomato paste packaging where you had the 24-month shelf life, I think in my experience is that these sorts of things always occur, that the brand owners want to service their entire market, but basically then they are over specifying 95% of their market for 5% of their market share.
Yeah, but I think that is not the foundation of this behavior. We have done it in the past like this, and automatically we will continue doing that. So when the design brief has been written, we take quite often the requirements from where we come from, and the new development should be at least equal to that, right?
That's a good point. Yep.
And now what you see under the, let's say, pressure of sustainability, environmental lobby, we also at Cargill start looking different at these kind of requirements and at the start of a project briefing already. Mm-hmm. And that's a big benefit. So you start to design now more with a sustainable view than 10 years ago, for sure.
That's a good point that you mentioned that, because the design for packaging also includes a lot of other aspects, like you mentioned before, transport, outer packaging, and the whole thing. To what extent does transport influence the design process of your packaging, for example?
Yeah, what I mentioned before, it depends on what we are designing. I think 10, 15 years ago, there was a very trendy sentence: we designed from cradle to cradle, right? And with that view, we also use that now again in Cargill, where we designed for the whole supply chain. So also including transport. Because if you damage your product during transport and have to throw it away, you come back to your food waste, right? Again, it's also money. Yeah? That's also why we do it. But it is also sustainability-wise good to optimize the whole transport situation.
Exactly, because we haven't even spoken about that yet, but food waste has a far bigger impact on the environment and on the carbon footprint than the packaging waste does.
Yes, for sure. And that is also what Cargill intends to do, because we have also farmers who have cattle for our meat industry or soya beans for our edible oil. We start already there to optimize with a sustainability view. And we go through process. So how can you increase the shelf life of a product in combination with what type of pack format you are choosing? That also includes a strive to monomaterial with recyclability opportunities, right? Until the transport and supply chain, but also on reducing or making more standard pack formats so that distribution centers or supermarket has to throw away less material. Even we try to think based on consumer insight studies, what we can do to improve until the consumer. And that whole chain is taken into consideration when a packaging development or packaging innovation starts.
Okay. I have one additional question on that. Based on your career and the multiple kinds of products you've worked on, what would you describe as the most challenging packaging development you have done in your career?
Yeah, there is one, but we did not succeed. So we did not put it on the market. So I'm afraid I cannot mention that because I'm not sure if that company is still working on it. It's all different challenges, I think. For instance, when I was working at Calvé, we moved to another technique to make and produce our glass wishbone bottle. And with that technique, we could reduce the weight by almost 200% with the same strength. That was a challenge at that time. Now it's common technology, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I think at this moment at Cargill, the move from a hot fill, easy opening metal can to a long lasting aseptic plastic reclosable cup, I'm the most proud of due to technologies. We have developed new technologies, for instance, applying a shrink sleeve from the bottom up, which was not there, but now it is on the market, until the commercial success. We increased about 12% market by moving from that can to a reclosable plastic cup. So in that respect, I like that project. Technically, the biggest challenge was the bottle weight reduction for edible oil, what I mentioned. That was technically the most challenging one.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting to know your perspective on that whole journey so far.
Yeah, what I always try to achieve is what I always call a win-win situation, right? When I have a idea on a packaging development or a packaging innovation, even if it's a good idea, I also have to sell it internally, right? And when I'm focused and mentioning only sustainability as the objective, it's not easy to sell. So the moment you can link that to a material saving or a reduction of product losses or an increase on line speed and line efficiency, then it's much easier to sell it internally as well. So that's why I'm always looking for that combination.
You told us that Cargill uses trial simulation. How exactly do they work?
Yeah, what we did, for instance, for the project for the reduction of bottle weight is we added data loggers inside the truck on different areas. You have to see that in Brazil, you have different regions. And depending on the region, they use different trucks, but also the quality of the road is different. So we added these data loggers inside the trucks, measuring the different data which occurred during a transport. Based on that, we could define exceptions, so extreme situations like an emergency brake, but we could also define a standard transport circumstances in a certain route. And these data loggers we can link to simulation equipment to mimic the same circumstances without spending a lot of time and money to put it on a real truck.
That sounds really elaborative, but also very costly. So you made a big effort there in order to get really results that you can really work with, right?
Yeah, what you see is until now there are standard ISTA circumstances which represent a certain test for your pallet during transport. However, it is a general program. What we wanted to know, we want to tailor-made it for our different regions, different countries, because then you can optimize not your pack only, but you can make a decision, what I mentioned already, that we say, okay, we want to develop and design this bottle for a standard transport. In extreme circumstances, we accept a certain damage and money loss. But because of this approach, you avoid overpacking for critical situations, which occurs once in a while.
But this means
so
that
it looks more expensive, but at the end, you save a lot of money.
But this means in basics that if you roll out a product from, let's say, Latin America to Europe, that you would look at the whole packaging situation again, because the circumstances here are different than they are in Latin America.
Exactly. And we even did studies on what the impact during transport is from the different type of trucks. So we identified the differences per truck. That means that in some cases, we use the extreme, but in other cases, we try to find a transport company who uses only one type of truck so that we know it's less severe.
Yeah.
It goes that far.
Wow.
But again, it is a lot of time, a lot of effort. But at the end, when you can use a simulation at a laboratory, for instance, or a special company who is measuring these simulations, and you can use your data logger to mimic a real transport circumstances, that is also a saving, because you do not have to transport the pallets to that transport company. It's always time. You have to send people over to investigate the situation. So you can do a lot more tests on faster and cheaper before you finally do a transit trial.
Exactly, because we are always looking at this from a European standpoint. But of course, if you ship from, let's say, Sao Paulo in Brazil to Manaus, which is, I don't know how many thousand kilometers, the cost for that are multiplied compared to if we ship some load from Germany to Spain.
Yeah, you also have to realize that in Brazil, for instance, you have big transport companies, but you have also people who owns a truck, which is 20 years old, and they are hired to transport also for Cargill, right? Yeah. So then you have a comparison with an air-feathered truck with a spring, an old mechanical spring feather. You can imagine that the circumstances inside a truck are significantly worse, right?
Yeah, correct.
So you have to be prepared for that.
That's really interesting. It's a totally new aspect that we didn't talk about before. So to wrap up this episode today, is there something more that you would like to add, Ron?
What I really like is to look at a win-win situation, right? So that it is good for the environment, that the impact on the environment is as low as possible, and look for a profit for the organization as well, a big benefit. That will drive the sustainability agenda in a company much better.
Yeah, I agree with that. So this concludes another episode of our podcast PACKOLUTION. Thank you, Ron, for sharing your work and knowledge with us and your experience as well. Very inspiring for us, at least, and hopefully for our listeners as well. Please stay tuned for more episodes of PACKOLUTION to come soon to the channel. Thank you.